The Wars of the Roses, one of the bloodiest periods in English history, stemmed from a variety of factors. They started with years of rising tensions between different groups of nobles in King Henry VI's government. England didn't fare well in the 100 Years' War in France. She lost all her European lands except for Calais, and the war's tactics infuriated the people. People believed that the king's favorites were selfish and dishonest, leading him to assign them to government positions when he was weak. When the 100 Years' War ended in 1453, the lands that King Henry V had won were taken back by the French, led by Joan of Arc, who was then King Charles VII. This caused political, economic, and social problems in England. The costly war in France resulted in a significant increase in taxes and deaths in England. This was especially true in the southeast of the country. From 1440 on, Europe's economy went into a deep freeze because of a drop in trade. The wars in England limited trade to Calais. The country had abandoned the feudal system, the statute of laborers had limited wages, and the Black Death had made necessities scarce. At that time, political structures were evolving, leading to the rise of a strong, powerful, and easily recognizable nobility. Town governments became more important as the towns grew, and more professionals and merchants moved there. The church stayed strong. The church possessed a substantial amount of land, and had the ability to provide loans for military purposes. It also served as a mediator, a banker, a diplomat, and was responsible for the spiritual well-being of the country. King Henry VI was either a terrible politician or a terrible military leader. Additionally, he struggled with mental health issues and failed to maintain peace. Unhappiness in the country led to Jack Cade's rebellion in 1450. Later, Richard, Duke of York, challenged the powerful elite and finally claimed the throne as a direct descendant of King Edward III. Elizabeth of York wanted to question King Henry VI, but the Lancastrian faction's ally, Margaret of Anjou, the king's French wife, refused. This led to a war that claimed many lives throughout the country. The Wars of the Roses originated from King Edward III of the Plantagenet dynasty in England, who ruled from 1327 to 1377. He married Philippa of Hainault, and had 5 sons, including Edward, the Black Prince. In the following century, descendants of John of Gaunt and Edmund of Langley fought a dynastic battle for the throne of England, resulting in the deaths of several princes of the royal blood. The term Wars of the Roses may have originated from a scene in Shakespeare's Henry VI, Part 1, where the Duke of Somerset plucks a red rose and the Duke of York a white rose for their emblems. The warring factions were united by King Henry VII, who married Elizabeth of York in 1486. The Black Death of 1348–49 in England led to the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, which was provoked by the proposal of a poll tax. King Edward III died in 1377, but his eldest son, the Black Prince, took the throne as King Richard II. The young king showed courage and stood firm against the rebels during the Peasants' Revolt, and his uncle, John of Gaunt, was loyal to him during his reign. King Henry IV died in 1413, and his eldest son, King Henry V, was the victor of the 100 Years' War with France. After a series of victories and the capture of Normandy, the Treaty of Troyes with France in 1420 recognized King Henry V as the heir to the French throne. However, before he could take the throne of France, Henry died of dysentery in 1422 while on a military campaign, and was succeeded by his 8-month-old son, who became King Henry VI. The government in England was taken up by a regent council led by the king's uncles, Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, and John, Duke of Bedford. On Whitsuntide, 19th of May, 1426, King Henry VI was knighted by his uncle John, Duke of Bedford, and created 44 other knights, including the 14-year-old Richard, Duke of York. The war with France continued under the direction of John, Duke of Bedford, who achieved several military victories against the French. Joan of Arc, a peasant girl who claimed to have heard angelic voices instructing her to free France from English rule, inspired the French to defeat the English in their defense of Orléans in 1429. In 1435, John, Duke of Bedford, died and was replaced as governor of Normandy and regent of France by Richard, Duke of York, as lieutenant general. King Henry VI, who had come of age, took control of the government, which was divided between factions led by Cardinal Beaufort and Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester. Despite his melancholy and religious interests, he was not a strong king or military leader. He was not well received by the kingdom, which was nearing bankruptcy and had a corrupt legal system. The Duke of York was appointed Lieutenant General of France in 1440, where he experienced greater success in military campaigns against the French. In 1444, William de la Pole was sent to negotiate a peace treaty with the French, which was signed with the Treaty of Tours. The treaty included a 2-year truce, the return of Maine and Anjou to France, and England keeping Normandy, Aquitaine and other territories won by King Henry V. King Henry VI married Margaret of Anjou in 1445, and she was crowned in 1447. In 1448, King Henry VI handed Maine and Anjou to the French after a siege of Le Mans by King Charles VII of France. The Duke of York was appointed as Lieutenant of Ireland, while the Duke of Somerset was appointed Governor of Normandy and Chief Commander. However, the Duke of Somerset was a failure as Commander-in-Chief, leading to the English declaring war in July 1449. Rouen was captured and the Duke of Somerset fled to Caen, but surrendered in July 1450. The remaining English possessions in France were Calais and the Duchy of Aquitaine. The Duke of Suffolk was targeted by the people for taking decisions independently of the royal council. He was accused of plotting an invasion of England, divulging intelligence to the French, ceding Maine and Anjou to King Charles VII without consent, and wishing to set his son on the throne with Lady Margaret Beaufort. He received a relatively light sentence of 5 years in exile. By the reign of King Henry VI, feudalism had given way to bastard feudalism, where wealthy magnates, including dukes, marquises, earls, viscounts, barons, knights and the gentry, controlled most of the landed wealth of the kingdom and exercised the greatest influence in their territories. In 1450, the Lancastrian government was bankrupt due to massive debts, lavish households, and the expensive war in France. King Henry VI had given away much of the royal lands to his favorites, leading to a loss of income. The country was united in its desire for law and order, an end to corruption and political stability. On Whitsuntide, 24th May 1450, armed men led by Jack Cade rose up in rebellion against the corrupt government. Cade used the name John Mortimer, probably to show connection to Richard, Duke of York. He published a manifesto with grievances against the government, including the giving away of crown lands, cruel taxes, bribery, election rigging, loss of lands in France, and government corruption. The rebellion of around 5,000 men was not a second peasants' revolt, but one of well-informed men who were realistic about their goals. The king and parliament sent an army south to London to confront the rebels, but they were rejected by the council. The rebels retreated to Sevenoaks in Kent, where the royal army mutinied and looted homes. The royal council took refuge in the Tower of London, while the rebels joined men from Essex, Sussex, and Surrey, who were united in their opposition to corrupt government officials. On 29 June 1450, Bishop William Ayscough, known to be corrupt, was murdered by the congregation. Jack Cade entered London like a conqueror, leading a mob that seized Lord Say and Seal, the Treasurer of England, and William Cromer, Sheriff of Kent. After losing 200 of his rebels, Jack Cade agreed to pardons and fled to the Sussex countryside, Lewes and Heathfield. In September 1450, Richard, Duke of York, returned from Ireland to London, where he demanded the dismissal of corrupt advisors, the return of crown lands, and the repayment of debts. He became a rival of Edmund Beaufort, 2nd Duke of Somerset. Parliament was opened in November 1450, and the Commons supported him, but the Lords remained opposed. In December 1450, Parliament impeached Somerset, who was later released. In 1451, Somerset was appointed Captain of Calais, despite his involvement in the loss of Normandy. The French occupied Bordeaux in June 1451, causing shock to the English. King Henry VI had no intention of implementing government reform, and the Duke of York decided to use force to bring about change. In February 1452, he led a force of several thousand men to London, where Margaret of Anjou persuaded the king to confront him. The Duke of York agreed to peace terms with the Duke of Somerset but was arrested and released. In October 1452, John Talbot, 1st Earl of Shrewsbury, marched on Bordeaux and recaptured the town. King Henry VI elevated his half-brother Jasper Tudor to the earldom of Pembroke, and his elder brother Edmund Tudor was created Earl of Richmond, Yorkshire. In 1453, the French King Charles VII invaded Aquitaine, but his army was cut down by cannon, and the Earl of Shrewsbury was killed. The French victory marked the end of the 100 Years' War with France, with only Calais remaining under English control. In August 1453, King Henry VI suffered a mental breakdown, possibly due to the news of the Battle of Castillon or his mother's father, King Charles VI of France. His condition was described as non compos mentis, meaning he was unaware of his surroundings. The illness brought the country into a political crisis, with Queen Margaret of Anjou and various factions fighting for control of the government. On the 13th of October 1453, Queen Margaret gave birth to a baby boy named Edward, who was baptized at Westminster Abbey. The question of a successor to King Henry VI was settled, but rumors circulated that the real father was the Duke of Somerset. In the north, tensions between the Percys and the Nevilles, the great magnates and landowners, erupted into violence. Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, was in dispute with Somerset over the lordship of Glamorgan, which formerly belonged to Warwick, and had been granted by the king to the Duke of Somerset. The alliance of York to the Nevilles became powerful, and the king was unable to acknowledge his new son. In January 1454, Margaret made a bid for power by becoming regent and taking over the royal prerogative. Parliament confirmed the king's new son as heir to the throne, but there was much intimidation from supporters of both factions. Edward of Lancaster was created Prince of Wales and the Duke of York appointed himself Captain of Calais in place of Somerset. He attempted to reform the royal finances and reduce the royal household. On Christmas Day 1454, the king recovered his health and was introduced to and acknowledged as his new son by Queen Margaret. However, it soon became clear that the king had not fully recovered, and his health was impaired by mental illness for years to come. In 1455, King Henry VI dismissed the Duke of York from his office as protector, and the Earl of Salisbury was replaced by Archbishop Thomas Bourchier. The Earl of Wiltshire was made treasurer, and Margaret of Anjou demanded the release of the Duke of Somerset. The Yorkist lords retreated to their estates, fearing Somerset would take revenge. By March 1455, Margaret of Anjou gained support from Henry Percy, 2nd Earl of Northumberland, and the 8th Lord Clifford, as well as nobility in Wales and the West Country. The king, Somerset, and the court party held a meeting at Westminster, but the Yorkist lords feared a trap similar to Humphrey Duke of Gloucester at Bury St. Edmunds in 1447. They mobilized their armed retainers to march to London, with the Duke of York, Earl of Salisbury, Earl of Warwick, Lord Clinton, Lord Grey of Powys, Lord Cobham, Sir Robert Ogle, and around 3,000 men. On the 18th of May 1455, Somerset received news of the Yorkist march to London and postponed the council meeting in Leicester. The Yorkist lords replied that they were loyal to the king and only raised an armed force to keep themselves out of danger. On the 21st of May 1455, the king and Somerset left Westminster with an army of about 2,000 men and joined up with loyal forces at St. Albans. The Lancastrian army, consisting mainly of nobility and East Anglian levies, was outnumbered and ill-prepared for battle. The Yorkists had troops, contingents of billmen and pikemen, and commanders like Sir Robert Ogle. King Henry VI summoned a roadside conference to discuss the situation with Somerset, who wanted to wait for reinforcements and prepare for battle. The Duke of Buckingham preferred to settle the matter with the Yorkists, by negotiation. On 22 May 1455, the royal army arrived at St. Albans, barricaded the Tonman Ditch, and marched up Holywell Street to St. Peter's Street. The Yorkist army had marched from Ware to Cock Lane and formed up in Keyfield. King Henry raised his banner at the town square, demanding the Duke of York's surrender, and the execution of the Duke of Somerset. King Henry commanded the execution of the lords, gentry and yeomen, sparing only the common soldiers. The Duke of York ordered his trumpeter to sound the alarm, and his troops began the attack against the Lancastrian army. The attack came as a surprise, as most had assumed a negotiated settlement. The alarm bell rang in the clock tower, and soldiers ran back to the defenses. In St. Albans Abbey, the monks and clergy fell to their knees and cried to St. Alban to save them from destruction, while the townspeople barricaded themselves fearfully in their homes. The Yorkist attacks on the bars at Shropshire Lane and Sopwell Lane faced heavy casualties due to their narrow lanes. The Yorkist cause appeared desperate as neither the Duke of York nor the Earl of Salisbury could break through. However, the course of the battle drastically changed when the Earl of Warwick led his force through the back gardens at the center of the barricades into the town. The Lancastrian defenders at the barricades fell back in confusion, hoping to join the king at the center of the town. Lord Clifford was killed with many of his commanders. The remaining Lancastrian nobility rallied around the king and the royal standard in the marketplace at St. Peter's Street. The Yorkist attack was so sudden that many were killed by a storm of arrows. The royal standard was abandoned possibly by the Earl of Wiltshire, and Henry Percy, 2nd Earl of Northumberland, son of Harry Hotspur, was killed. The Duke of York ordered him to be taken to the abbey for his safety while the fighting continued in the town. The Lancastrian nobles who were not wounded had their horses and armor stolen and their goods plundered. Lord Falkenberg was quietly allowed to escape because the Yorkists were his close relatives. After a battle between York, Salisbury and Warwick, the king forgave them, and ordered them to cease plundering the townsfolk and Lancastrians. The Duke of York learned from his mistakes at Blackheath, and assembled an experienced fighting force, resulting in the deaths of the Duke of Somerset, Earl of Northumberland, and Lord Clifford. The king's knights and squires were later buried at the abbey, but their tombs were destroyed in the Reformation. The Yorkist army escorted King Henry VI back to London, with the Duke of York as the chief of state. On 25 May 1455, the king showed his authority at St. Paul's Cathedral, but the Duke of York was appointed Constable of England, Viscount Bourchier Treasurer, and Salisbury Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster. In July 1455, the Duke of York established himself as the head of government, with Archbishop Thomas Bourchier remaining as Chancellor. Margaret of Anjou was excluded from London and summoned to Parliament to reconcile the warring parties. An Act of Resumption was passed, cancelling all land grants made by the king except to the Tudors. Margaret of Anjou was cultivating support among nobles to the Lancastrian cause, including Henry Beaufort, Edmund, Owen Tudor, Henry Percy, Earl of Wiltshire, and Lord Clifford. In February 1456, King Henry VI appeared in Parliament and relieved the Duke of York of his duties. The king amended the Act of Resumption to prevent further hostilities, but London remained sympathetic to the Yorkists. In April 1456, the king appointed the Earl of Warwick captain of Calais, which became the base of Yorkist opposition to the king. Margaret of Anjou persuaded the king to dismiss Viscount Henry Bourchier as treasurer and Archbishop Bourchier as chancellor. In November 1456, Edmund Tudor, Earl of Richmond, died in Carmarthen Castle, possibly of plague, and the properties jointly owned with his brother Jasper Earl of Pembroke came to Pembroke, who became a loyal supporter of the Lancastrian cause in Wales. Margaret gave birth to her only child at Pembroke Castle, named Henry after the king. The Earl of Warwick in Calais dealt with piracy in the Channel, becoming popular with merchants and promoting the Yorkist cause. On March 24, 1458, an official ceremony of reconciliation took place between the king and queen and the Yorkist lords, known as Love Day. In 1459, Queen Margaret of Anjou persuaded the king to issue writs to loyal magnates to meet with him in Leicester. She also ordered commissions to conscript young men. The Duke of York and Earl of Salisbury began preparations for war and a campaign of propaganda against the queen. York and Salisbury rallied their retainers, which the Queen interpreted as treason. Queen Margaret distributed the Silver Swan to her followers in Cheshire, while the King recruited an army in the Midlands. The Earl of Warwick raised 400 archers and 200 men-at-arms, arriving in London on the 21st of September. Margaret of Anjou intercepted him at Staffordshire, and Lord Audley commanded local Lancastrian forces to capture the Earl of Salisbury. Salisbury, an experienced military commander, faced 10,000 men led by Lord Audley. Lord Audley left Market Drayton with his army to intercept the Yorkist force heading towards him. On the 23rd of September 1459, Yorkist scouts spotted the Lancastrian army at Blore Heath and reported to Salisbury. Salisbury moved his troops to a ridge behind a stream called Wemberton Brook, and the Yorkists formed a line parallel to the brook. The battle began with an archery duel, but Lord Audley refused to let the Earl of Salisbury pass. The Yorkists returned and fired arrows, cutting down the Lancastrians and beating back the attack.
Breaking news.
A second attack was more successful, but Lord Audley was killed in the intense fighting. Lord Dudley took over the command and ordered a third attack on foot, but this failed. Around 500 Lancastrian troops joined the Yorkists and turned against their own men. The Yorkists chased the remaining Lancastrian troops off the field, killing about 2,000 and capturing Lord Dudley. The Earl of Salisbury won a great victory and lost around 500 dead, allowing him to resume his march to Ludlow. The Lancastrian forces retreated to Eccleshall Castle, where King Henry VI was shocked and saddened. The Earl of Salisbury escaped the battlefield and reached Ludlow, where he was asked by the king to offer a free pardon to those who fought against him. The Yorkist forces, consisting of around 8,000 men, marched towards Worcester, heading for London. However, the king's army blocked their path in battle order, and the Duke of York ordered a retreat into Worcester. The royal army pursued the Yorkists into Worcester, and York retreated to Tewkesbury and marched over the River Severn back to Ludlow. On the 10th of October, 1459, the king's army arrived, and the Duke of York wanted to negotiate with the king and resolve outstanding grievances. He protested his loyalty but was intercepted and sent a herald to offer a free pardon to those who submitted. The king's troops were low morale and some defected to the royal forces as another pardon was offered. The Lancastrian soldiers then crossed the bridge, arrested the main Yorkist supporters, and sacked the town and castle, robbing it of its treasures. The Duchess of York was found at the market cross with her two youngest sons and her daughter Margaret, and placed with her children into the care of her sister, the Duchess of Buckingham. The king and queen returned in triumph to Coventry and disbanded their army. But the Yorkist lords fled and were still at large. The Duke of York escaped to Devon, crossed over to Wales and then by ship to Ireland, where he had a great deal of support. In Calais, the Yorkist lords raided the countryside, seizing merchant ships and mounting a propaganda campaign against the government. On 20 November 1459, a parliament was summoned, and Margaret of Anjou indicted the Duke of York and his supporters on charges of treason. In January 1460, Lord Rivers, his wife the Duchess of Bedford, and their son Anthony were at Sandwich, planning an invasion of Calais. However, the Earl of Warwick captured them and their ships, leading to the Lancastrian government expecting a Yorkist invasion. Warwick sailed to Ireland to consult with the Duke of York, who planned an invasion from the north and through Kent against the Lancastrian government. The Duke of Exeter was appointed Admiral of England, but his men were insufficiently paid, and their sympathy was with the Yorkists. Warwick arrived in Calais and propaganda was issued against the Lancastrian government. Lord Fauconberg, Sir John Wenlock and Sir John Dynham captured Sandwich and landed with 2,000 troops. Warwick urged support from towns in Kent, and the Archbishop of Canterbury-Bourchier urged support for the Yorkists. The Yorkist force passed through Rochester and Dartford, and Lord Scales commanded the Tower of London. Lord Fauconberg left London with the Yorkist vanguard, while the King's army stayed in Coventry. On the 10th of July, 1460, the Yorkist army arrived at Northampton, But the Earl of Warwick wanted to avoid battle with the king. He sent the Bishop of Salisbury and Archbishop of Canterbury Bourchier to hear their grievances, but the king and Duke of Buckingham refused. The Yorkist army was twice the size of the royal force, making it far from safe. The Lancastrian army drew up in battle order, with the Duke of Buckingham commanding the left flank, John Talbot, 2nd Earl of Shrewsbury, Thomas Percy, Lord Egremont and Lord Beaumont the centre, and Lord Edmund Grey of Ruthin on the right. Warwick sent a message to the Duke of Buckingham, but when his request was refused, he ordered the attack. The Yorkists were met with arrows, heavy rain, and treachery. Lord Grey had sent a secret message to the Earl of March that he would fight for the Yorkists if they supported him in a property dispute with the Duke of Exeter. The Yorkist army won a great victory with around 300 Lancastrian dead. Margaret of Anjou, who had been waiting with the Prince of Wales for news at Eccleshall Castle, departed to Harlech Castle in Wales to stay with Jasper Tudor, and from there to Denbigh. In London, Lord Scales was besieging the Earl of Salisbury, Cobham, and the city's militia. On 16th July, the king arrived with the Yorkist lords and stayed at the bishop's palace while the Londoners celebrated the Yorkist victory. Lord Scales decided to surrender, but was murdered by the London boatmen. Margaret of Anjou left Denbigh and sailed from Wales to Berwick and then travelled to Scotland. She was received sympathetically by the Scottish Queen, Mary of Guelders, who offered help and loans in return for the surrender of the town of Berwick to Scotland. The Duke of York was convinced that the only way to establish good government was to assert his claim to the throne as the descendant of Lionel of Clarence, second surviving son of King Edward III. On 8 September 1460, the Duke of York returned from Ireland and landed in North Wales, where he stayed with his Duchess at Baynard's Castle in London. Parliament assembled at Westminster on 7 October 1460, where Viscount Bourchier was made Treasurer of England and George Neville, Warwick's brother and the Bishop of Exeter, was appointed Chancellor. On 16 October, the Duke of York formally laid a claim to the crown by inheritance and submitted a genealogy of descent from King Henry III. The Act of Accord was passed by Parliament, which stated that King Henry VI should stay on the throne of England as long as he lives, with the Duke of York becoming his designated heir. Margaret of Anjou marched south with Scottish troops, reinforced by recruits from Northumberland, Westmoreland, Cumberland and Lancashire. She joined forces with the Dukes of Somerset, Exeter, Earls of Devon, Wiltshire, Lords Clifford, Roos, Greystoke, Neville and Latimer. Queen Margaret protested against the Act of Accord and marched south to London to rescue the king. However, her soldiers were allowed to plunder estates and tenants of York and Salisbury, and York's castle at Sandal was raided by the Lancastrians. The Duke of York mounted a propaganda campaign against the Queen, accusing her troops of lawlessness, and prepared to march north. London refused Queen Margaret's request for military aid and money, but made funds available to finance the Duke of York. On the 9th of December 1460, the Duke marched out of London with his son, the Earl of Rutland, and around 5,000 men heading north and enlisting more recruits. York had about 6,000 men, most of whom were billeted around the castle or sent on foraging duties. A Christmas truce was agreed with the Duke of Somerset, which lasted until the Feast of Epiphany on the 6th of January. The Duke of York launched an attack on the forces at Sandal Common on the 30th of December 1460, initially gaining an advantage. However, the troops led by the Earl of Northumberland counterattacked the Yorkists, and the surrounding Lancastrians realized that there was a pitched battle in motion. Lord Rouse joined the attack with his men, and York attempted an orderly withdrawal back to Sandal Castle. The Earl of Salisbury rallied his captains and rode out to York's aid. The troops led by Andrew Trollope and the Duke of Exeter joined the attack, and York realized that he was being overwhelmed by a superior force. Richard, Duke of York, was surrounded and killed by multiple blows, and his entire army discomfited. The battle ended, and the surviving Yorkist troops fled for their lives, hotly pursued by the Lancastrians. The Earl of Warwick inherited his father's lands in the north, and became the wealthiest magnate in the land. As the 17-year-old Edmund Earl of Rutland attempted to escape over Wakefield Bridge, Lord Clifford demanded to know who he was. He stabbed the Earl of Rutland and Aspall to death, leading to blood feuds between the magnates. About 2,000 Yorkist troops were killed in the battle, and their bodies were buried in Pontefract. A memorial was later erected in York's memory on the road between Sandal and Wakefield, which was replaced by a Victorian monument in 1897. In January 1461, Margaret of Anjou marched from Scotland with an army provided by Queen Mary of Guelders to link up with the main Lancastrian forces based in York. She was determined to take advantage of the victory at Wakefield and eliminate the Yorkist threat. The Scottish Queen was unable to provide funds, so her troops were promised unlimited freedom to plunder the estates south of the River Trent. As news spread in the northern regions, the Lancastrian army was swelled by many recruits attracted by the prospect of loot. The Yorkists spread propaganda against the Lancastrian lords and their plans to rob and pillage the countryside, murder the citizens, and rape the women. Many men in the southern regions flocked to the Yorkist ranks to defend their lands and property. The ruling council voted to grant the Earl of Warwick a loan for defense and issued commissions of array to recruit more troops. Margaret of Anjou intended to march south to London with her army while the Earl of Pembroke raised an army in Wales, along with French, Breton, and Irish mercenaries recruited by the Earl of Wiltshire. The combined Lancastrian forces were to link up and march to London to deal with the Yorkist government. Edward Earl of March summoned his troops from various regions to join him at Hereford. As Edward prepared to march to London, he received news that a Lancastrian army consisting of Tudor retainers from Pembroke and Carmarthen had formed up to his north. Edward formed his troops into 3 battles, with the left wing commanded by Sir Walter Devereux, the centre by himself, and the left wing by Sir William Herbert. On 20 January 1461, Margaret of Anjou arrived in York with her Scottish army and joined forces with the Lancastrian nobles. Her allies agreed to her surrender of Berwick to Scotland, and the marriage of the Prince of Wales to the Scottish Queen, Mary of Guelders. The Lancastrian army, led by the Duke of Somerset and the Earl of Northumberland, began marching south along the Great North Road, stealing, looting, raping, torturing, and burning towns and villages. Many people fled south, while others joined the forces led by the Earl of Warwick. Warwick and his brother, Sir John Neville, prepared to leave London on 12 February 1461 with a 10,000-man Yorkist army to face the Lancastrian forces led by Margaret of Anjou. The Lancastrians had 15,000 troops, led by Henry Beaufort, Henry Percy, and others. Warwick deployed his army north of St. Albans, facing the Lancastrian approach, and occupied Dunstable. However, a small Yorkist force led by Sir Robert Poynings and a local butcher saved the town from pillage but were swiftly annihilated. The Lancastrian columns quickly reorganized and moved north against the main Yorkist army at Bernard's Heath, led by Sir John Neville. The northern men entered the town and wanted to pass through the middle of it to direct their army against the king's army. However, they were forced to turn back and flee to the west end of the town, where they had a great fight with a small band of people of the king's army. Sir John Neville engaged the Lancastrian force in fierce hand-to-hand fighting at Bernard's Heath without the help of the defeated archers. He sent urgent messages to Warwick asking for assistance, but reinforcements were not forthcoming. The Lancastrians won a great victory, with around 2,000 Yorkists killed due to their boldness and better strategy. King Henry VI lost control of the Yorkists and was reunited with Queen Margaret and his son Edward, Prince of Wales. On 6 March 1461, King Edward IV issued a proclamation to 33 counties to accept him as king, and a pardon with some named exceptions to any followers of King Henry VI who submitted within 10 days. He dispatched the Duke of Norfolk to East Anglia to recruit more troops for the Yorkist army. The Earl of Warwick was then issued commissions of array to raise forces in various counties. On 11 March 1461, Lord Fauconberg led the vanguard of the best Yorkist troops out of London, heading north with the men from London, the Welsh Marches, and those from Kent led by Robert Horne. King Edward IV followed through Bishopsgate with the main body of the army and a train of supplies of food and weapons. He passed through Barnet, St. Albans, Barkway and reached Cambridge on 17 March, recruiting more soldiers en route. The Yorkist army now totaled around 25,000 men, while the Lancastrians had a larger force of about 35,000 based in York. Edward arrived at Pontefract in Yorkshire on 27 March as the Lancastrians retreated north of the River Aire. King Henry VI was in York with Queen Margaret and the Prince of Wales, where he sat out the battles, leaving his military commanders to lead his troops. In the cold March winds, Lord Fitzwalter was sent by King Edward with his men to capture the bridge over the River Aire at Ferrybridge. However, the bridge was broken, and many were slain on both sides. The Yorkist troops repaired the bridge, crossed the River Aire, and camped out on the north bank. Lord Fauconberg, an experienced veteran of the 100 Years' War, outmaneuvered Lord Clifford's troops, leading to the death of Butcher Clifford and the loss of his son Henry. On 29 March 1461, King Edward IV of England faced the Lancastrian army at Towton, a fierce battle that had usurped his inheritance. The Lancastrian army was led by Henry Beaufort, 3rd Duke of Somerset, Henry Holland, 3rd Duke of Exeter, Henry Percy, and his brothers Sir Richard and Sir Ralph, Thomas Courtenay, 14th Earl of Devon, Lord Roos, Lord Dacre, Lord Willoughby, Lionel, 6th Lord Wells and the Earl of Wiltshire. King Edward IV's army was deployed on higher ground to the south with their vanguard led by Lord Fauconberg, centered by the Earl of Warwick and reserve force by King Edward IV himself. Lord Fauconberg ordered his archers to advance and fire volleys of arrows at long range, causing considerable casualties. The Lancastrian men-at-arms had some degree of protection with their body armor, but the common soldiers and archers suffered terrible wounds from the arrow storm. The battle was savage and relentless, with no quarter asked or given. King Edward harangued his troops, promising to live or die with them in order to give them courage. The Duke of Somerset launched an ambush from Castle Hill Wood on the Lancastrian right wing, leading to the death of many of his soldiers. However, King Edward managed to reinforce his left wing and the line held. The Yorkist army was pushed back on the ridge by superior weight of numbers and appeared on the verge of defeat. However, help was soon at hand with the late arrival of the Duke of Norfolk's troops, who attacked the Lancastrian line, leading to a mass panic. The fight continued for over 10 hours in equal balance until King Henry, the Duke of Somerset, espied the forces of his foes increase and his own yield. King Edward IV had won a great victory, but it was incomplete as long as King Henry VI and Margaret of Anjou were at large and able to gather support. He gave his thanks to God and rode into York with his army in procession, replacing the heads of his father, brother, and uncle with those of the Earl of Devon and other Lancastrians.